Okay, thank you very much. So I've read this book. It's a brilliant book. I'm interested in artificial intelligence through some of the work we do in fighting misinformation. And as I've realized over time, and including when I read this book, that's only one slice of the larger, I don't know, mango, potato, whichever fruit you want to call it. But I think the important thing is to see and understand how artificial intelligence is affecting us and indeed is indeed dominating our lives, and in some cases much more so, depending on which part of the world you are. And the best way to see that is when you actually experience it and or do it through the eyes of a journalist like Madhumita, which is on ground in various countries she's been to, and seeing the multitude of applications, because the applications are good. It could be a primary healthcare center or a small hospital, non-profit hospital in Maharashtra. It could be a lady who is doing artificial intelligence, tagging for artificial intelligence viewing systems sitting in Bulgaria. It could be someone in Latin America, again using AI for construction. But the applications of AI actually are quite vast. And many of us know some of them. I mean, we would guess so intuitively, but I think it's only when you read a book like this do you get a sense on how it's permeated our lives. The most obvious and visible example that some of us at least are already familiar with when it comes to facial recognition is DigiYatra. So I'm a great user and proponent of DigiYatra because of the sheer convenience it offers. But when you get convenience, you're obviously trading off something. You're trading off privacy, you're trading off your data, your information, and your very features and your face. And God knows what someone can do with it. But at this point, I'm happy because it allows me to enter the airport and reach my gate in 15 minutes, which would have not have been possible earlier because you had to stand at the entrance of the terminal and show your identity card and your ticket, and someone will physically scan, look at it, and then look you up, down, and so on. So I think that's one part of it. The other part of it, I think, is as AI permeates our lives, and it appears to me, and I'm sure she's going to elaborate on this, there is no walking back on most of it. I think some of it we can walk back if we fight back. We are seeing artificial intelligence linked regulation coming in, including in Europe, which usually sets the trend for regulation across the world. But is it and India as well? But how that regulation will play out, where will it actually start limiting some of the damage that AI is doing, we don't know. And in many countries, China, for example, AI is an integral part of how the state surveils its people. And we're seeing parts of that in Western democracies as well. So I'm going to pause here. I think there are a lot of interesting things to cover. So I'm going to ask Madhumita to talk a little bit about the most obvious question, which is why she wanted to write a book like this, what it's taken her, as in what is the span and scope of effort that you've put in, and how did you choose the different kinds of examples, and maybe how did you find them as well? You've traveled to Africa, and some very fascinating examples of how people are sitting in Kenya and doing, again, visual mapping for artificial intelligence systems sitting in Silicon Valley. So this is the digital coolies that we know about from looking at, let's say, IT services companies or business process outsourcing companies in India. But this is a slightly different scale, which again, I didn't know, and I didn't know the extent to which it had already grown. So over to you.
So that's many questions in one. So I'm going to start with the question of why I wrote this book. So I've been writing about AI and technology for about 12 years now. It was the first job I had was at Wired magazine, which is a very techy magazine for sort of innovators and entrepreneurs and those who kind of want to upend the status quo. And I was introduced to it as a scientist. I came from a background of designing vaccines for HIV, so I really didn't know anything about tech before I joined. But this was 2012, and this was the rise of apps, the mobile platforms. This is when social media companies really blossomed from tiny university-based startups and were becoming sort of on the way to becoming the behemoths that they are today. And founders like Travis Kalanick, who founded Uber, were answering their own emails and agreeing to meet me for coffee because nobody else knew who he was. And so I kind of grew up with this technology as I reported on it. And I remember the first thing I ever wrote about AI was I traveled to visit a paralyzed woman in Connecticut, who had a chip implanted in her brain, and she could use it because of AI. She was able to use it to move a robotic arm and pick up a glass of water for the first time in years. And I was really kind of entranced by the promise and the potential of this technology, which at the time really felt very fringe, very maverick, and edgy. Now, 10, 11 years later, this is mainstream. It's mainstream enough that our kids are interfacing and interacting with it at school. It's powering some of the most valuable companies in the world. And from all of the writing and reporting I had done and what I had seen my contemporaries around the world do, there was this fascination, an obsession even with the makers of the technology, the entrepreneurs who we put on a pedestal, the Elon Musks and the Mark Zuckerbergs and most lately Sam Altmans of the world, and why they did what they were doing and the power that they wield. But for me, the reason that I was drawn to writing about tech to begin with was always because of the human impact. As I said, I came from a science and an immunology background. I'd always been interested in how can this impact us, and change our lives. And I never saw stories of ordinary people and their interactions and interfaces with AI in particular. So about 3 years ago, as the world shut down and I had a baby, I was kind of stuck at home with two young kids, and it forced me to think about what I wanted as my next sort of creative challenge. It was a moment for me, and I decided to write this book, which I promised myself would not take me to Silicon Valley. So I did not. The making of this book did not involve traveling to California, but instead going to unexpected places far away from that little enclave where all the power sits, at least in this world, to understand the ripple effects and the far-reaching consequences of AI. And the other thing was, we often talk about AI, maybe not now because of Chat GPT, but over the last 5 years as a future thing. When it becomes good enough, it's going to change jobs. It means that everybody will have so much income that we can all retire and sit on the beach forever. And it was always kind of looking into the future. Whereas I had already seen how it was today embedded in this very invisible way into our daily lives. When you call your bank to get a loan or a mortgage, there are AI systems that are filtering those applications. HR departments all over the world are using it to filter their recruitment process. In our daily apps that we use, all of our recommendations on Netflix, on Spotify, these are all AI powered, right? And I felt that we weren't exploring how that was changing the way we were living. So that for me was the goal, to travel to Argentina, Bulgaria, Kenya, to find stories in rural India, in Xinjiang in China, and to bring those to the fore. But using those stories to show how the specter of Silicon Valley looms large still, and how that concentration of power continues to grow. So that was the big idea.
So I think it will be useful also to get a few definitions out of the way. So when you say artificial intelligence in the way you've written about it, what does it mean? And how is it distinct from, let's say, computation or computing that we can or we are usually used to?
So I think artificial intelligence is today a marketing term largely. Everybody's slapping it on, but ultimately it's applied statistics, right? Even today, even the most powerful generative AI systems, like chatbots, like image generators, it is very powerful applied statistics. What they all have in common, I guess, is that they require huge amounts of data, and that might be words, it might be pixels. If it's healthcare, it could be X-ray scans of tuberculosis. It might be financial data. The data varies, but the system ultimately what it does is kind of comb through these huge data sets and pull out patterns with unexpected findings that maybe are often invisible to the human eye, right? So that's the power of these technologies. They're predictive, so they're able to find the patterns and predict what might come next. And as you say, I talk about quite a varied bunch of these, but I think in every case, it involves a statistical system trained on a large amount of data that is making some sort of predictive decision that has a deep impact on people's lives.
So let's pick on a few examples that you've used. So talk about one example where you think it's great for humanity, and another example where you think it exposes the let's say the dark side of what AI can do.
So I've always been very optimistic about tech, and maybe that's just down to me. I'm a generally optimistic person, but I've also seen amazing examples, as I said when I first started out, of innovations that were really changing people's lives, and that I had hope would push the boundaries of what we know and what we can do as scientists or as doctors. That's the that's how I started out my career. But over the years that I've covered it, I have seen the dark side of it through my reporting. A large part of what I've done over the last few years at the FT has been looking at data as an industry, exploring it as in ad tech, for example, and how data has been used to profile people, to target them, and ultimately to build trillion-dollar business models out of that we all use today. So when I started the book, I wanted to take a step back and not get into the debate of is this good or bad. I didn't want to, sit on either side of it, but be nuanced about it, and find the gray areas here. So I went in agnostic, and I would say the balance is like 2 to 8 with positive and negative stories, but I remain hopeful, and we can talk about that.
You're
But
saying 2 positive and 8 negative?
I would say so in my book. But, I mean, I still hope that people take away, we can talk about the people who fight back and find a voice within this system. And I think that's what keeps me hopeful. But in terms of an application area that I'm optimistic about, I would say healthcare for me is where I see the most life-changing potential. The story that I focus on in my book is Dr. Ashita Singh. So she was a doctor who trained in Tamil Nadu, but went to work in very, very rural, isolated parts of India. She's currently in Chinchpada, which is a tiny village on the border of Maharashtra and Gujarat, where most of her patients are from the Bhil Adivasi tribe. And it's a tiny hospital with she and her husband he's the surgeon and she's the doctor, and they have about 3 people helping them. It's like a 60-bed hospital. And she's been testing and training an AI system built in Bombay, built in Mumbai here by Cure AI, which is a local startup, where essentially an app that you take a picture of an X-ray of a patient, and it tells you it predicts how sure it is that might be a tuberculosis X-ray, right? And for her, she says this is absolutely life changing for the patients that she serves, because there are just parts of the area that she serves where there are no doctors or nurses or really any trained medical professionals, and she sees all the time people dying of what's a curable, treatable disease, right? And this could be a filter. And the same company is going to do an expedition in the next few months up into the foothills of the Himalayas to work with a population of Nepalese people who have a particular type of chest infection that's very hard to diagnose. And they're going to be testing the AI system there too. And this is in India. You can see how it can fill these gaps. Kind of the infrastructure can be enhanced and augmented to really save lives. But it's not just India, right? In the UK, our NHS is broken. There's a huge shortage of radiologists. It has the highest rates of cancer death across Europe now, and it's because of this huge shortage of trained professionals and lack access to care. And again, you can see how it could play such a huge role in getting people seen earlier, right? So that for me is the most hopeful example. I think where AI falls down is where we try to get it to make decisions about messy human things, social decisions. So when we bring it into deciding who should get bail, or whether someone is likely to go on to commit a crime. This is an example in my book. There was a single mother in Amsterdam who received a letter saying her 14-year-old would go on to commit a serious crime. This was predicted using AI technology, and she basically had the entire Amsterdam city social services kind of break into her life to try and prevent this so-called future from ever coming to life. I think human behavior and these types of social decisions are so in many ways unpredictable. They have the chaos of human behavior. It's why we still don't have self-driving cars, right? It's impossible to create a perfect
So
system.
can I delve into that Amsterdam example, because it's interesting, because I mean this is one of those technologies which is there today and will be here tomorrow, or it could be. So what it's doing is it's picked up about 700 people roughly, young people of a certain, and it's all profiled because the data is already in the system, and the Amsterdam, the local government, it's the municipal government of
Yeah, the
Amsterdam.
mayor. Yeah.
They're essentially saying this: here are these 700 people who could commit crimes tomorrow, and therefore we are already catching them today.
Yeah,
Right? So it's
it
a
wasn't
predictive.
supposed to be quite that punitive. It was supposed to be a social intervention. So the goal was that we'll find the children who might become the serious criminals of tomorrow, and we'll help these families. So we'll go in and say, what do you need to be supported? Is it jobs? Is it education? How can the system, how can the government help? That was the goal with which it was conceived. But like many of the stories and the people in my book, where it falls down is in how the conception is actually enacted, how it's implemented, which is often done so thoughtlessly, without having humans at the heart of it.
So by being part of this list, I have already been discriminated against, which in turn will ensure that I don't get the job or I will not be, let's say, accepted in society in a certain way. So it's a catch-22. As I think, and you've given a few other examples of this kind.
Exactly.
Because the
It's
technology is spotting you. Yeah.
self-perpetuating. Yeah, because what happened when these children were on the list is their photos were pasted up in the local police station as sort of, these are the kids to look out for, right? So in the neighborhoods, when they would be hanging out doing nothing wrong, police would kind of just call them out by name to kind of tell them, I know who you are. So they felt that they were being watched. Often when they were applying for internships or jobs, that would flash up because all of the social welfare systems are connected. So what was supposed to be, something that was, a policy of care turned out to be something extremely coercive and punitive because of the police's involvement. Because rather than having, educators or social workers, it was police who were kind of playing a huge role in this.
And this database obviously was scanning through a certain demographic profile or profiles and zeroing in on what?
So technically, it was race blind, gender blind, age, all of that, which is what most AI creators tell you that their systems are. This doesn't consider gender as a variable, this doesn't include race, etc. But the whole point of machine learning systems is that they find patterns without you feeding them the obvious variables, right? So a simpler example of that is Amazon had an AI system that they trialed as part of their recruitment. And what they did was train it on a whole bunch of CVs of people they had previously hired, and then give the software new CVs and say, find us the best candidates based on our previous best. And what the system learned to do based on the data was essentially to spot women, not by looking at their actual filled out gender, because that was blacked out, but by looking at their extracurricular activities. So if you had women's chess or, whatever, feminism groups or women's rights in your extracurriculars, it was spotting that and it was filtering female CVs out of the system because it had learned that none of the previous successful CVs tended to be women. So, despite being a gender blind AI system, it was able to correlate that and essentially still had a biased output. So, similarly, with the top 600 and top 400 criminal algorithms. The variables they were using were things like school truancy, but also things like, have they been victims of domestic violence? Have they been witnesses of violence in the neighborhood? Has anybody in their family ever committed a crime? So it was associating them with family members or friends, neighbors, and therefore zeroing in on a very specific population, which tended to be mostly North African, Moroccan immigrants, and Surinamese immigrants, and 98% boys. So it was largely male, largely African immigrants.
So the training of the algorithm is obviously critical, and in some areas this is also called prompt engineering for artificial intelligence. So now, tell us about. I mean, you've covered a lot of people, individuals, and communities where people are working on this. I mean, who are either training car self-driving systems or training the algorithm to do something quite, let's say, dangerous, but somewhere else in the world. So tell us about some of those examples.
Yeah, so I wanted to start the book by kind of pulling back the curtain a little bit on AI, and we talked about how it's this marketing term, and in the book I talked to a science fiction writer, Ted Chiang, whose short stories I highly recommend everyone here reads. They are fantastic, and one of them was turned into the film Arrival, and he writes a lot about language and cognition, and human and technology. And we were talking about AI, and he said he saw something which said it's a poor choice of words that was made in 1954, which I think really resonates, because by calling it AI, we kind of imbue it with something that is conscious in some way or aware, because we're calling it intelligent, and that's how we perceive intelligence. But as we know, and as I've explained, it's purely statistics at this point. And so I wanted to tell a story that pulled back that mystery around it to show how it really works. And I think one of the misconceptions has been that AI is somehow self-learning, that you let it loose on the data, and yes, it picks out patterns, but that it needs nothing else. So a bit like a child, you sort of give it the tools and it figures stuff out for itself. This isn't true. Even the most sophisticated AI systems today, let's take generative AI, GPT-4, which powers ChatGPT, it's been labeled and trained on labeled data. So, for example, let's take Tesla. It has, self-driving aspects to its cars. That software has to be taught what it's looking at. So you have videos of scenes of, driving down a road, and you have to teach the system that it's looking at a person versus an animal versus a traffic signal, or a cone in the road, and it has to learn to differentiate between these, and you need humans to do this. These tasks are actually pretty easy for humans. Even my 4-year-old can tell you the difference between a cow and a car and a human, but it's not simple for a completely naive machine learning system. And so you basically need tens of thousands of human beings to watch all of this footage, to look at snippets of text, if it's ChatGPT, and label, draw little boxes around these objects and say what these things are, so that you can train these systems. Obviously, if you need to do this at scale, it's an expensive endeavor. And so these companies have looked to the developing world, to the global south, however we describe that. And so you have factories in Nairobi, in Gulu in Uganda, which is a place that was torn apart by civil war, in parts of India too, in the Philippines, in Bulgaria, mostly staffed by refugees from the Middle East. On the plus side, these are digital jobs for people who didn't have many other opportunities. So my trip to Nairobi was to visit data workers in their homes. About 80% of these workers for the company I visited in Nairobi come from Kibera, which is the largest informal settlement in Africa of about 1 million people, right in the center of Nairobi. And previous to these jobs, these kids, they're mostly very young, in their 20s, are doing sort of construction jobs or selling food in the street. They're not doing digital jobs. So this is an opportunity for them to learn to do that. But sort of what I learned from spending time with them and the jobs they were doing is, yes, they're offered a minimum wage in return for the work that they do, but the promise of AI that we all talk about here in this room, or in California or in the UK, this promise that it's going to lift all of us up, it's going to create billions, maybe trillions of dollars of wealth, it's going to democratize access to intelligence. That's what we're being sold, right? That upside was not being seen by people who are working on building these and training these systems, because they were still being paid this depressed wage. They didn't often know who the client was on the other end. They didn't know they were working for Meta or Tesla or OpenAI, which they were. And in many cases, they weren't allowed to tell people what they were working on. They had to sign NDAs. And in the case of content moderation, where these labelers are actually looking at really disturbing content in order to filter them off from Facebook and Instagram. And they're training algorithms to essentially do their jobs. They weren't allowed to take breaks. They had like 2 bathroom breaks, and you're watching hours and hours of some of the worst content on the internet. So it was, I went in with this open mind about how this is lifting people out of poverty, but was ultimately very disappointed in how AI really manifested. I found it really not that different to the outsourcing inequalities that we've seen in fashion and elsewhere.
And what I could conclude, or rather infer, was that the reason a Tesla car will distinguish from between someone crossing a road and a lamppost is because someone in Kenya looked at that image and then marked out and said, this is a human being, and this is a man or a woman, and this is a lamppost.
Yeah, and it wasn't just one person, right? It would have been thousands and thousands of them spread out across the global south, and because of whom these technologies exist, but who are completely invisible in the supply chain.
So the other thing you've talked about in your book is, again, a phenomenon that we are used to is the gig economy and those who work in it. We have the Swiggies of the world, or the Uber Eats earlier. People who deliver to us, Uber drivers, or Ola drivers in India, and it's a very fascinating ecosystem which I didn't quite know about the way you've described it. So why don't you tell us?
Yeah. So for me, the final third of the book was trying to find stories, because the trend for me through the book, in terms of how AI impacts people, was how it was curtailing agency. That feeling that we have, that we can change the world around us, that we have a say, that we can make a change in our own circumstances, that was being dulled the more automation was being introduced into our lives. So I was looking for examples of how people were finding a voice and a way to fight back against something that can be very opaque, and faceless. And I met Armin Sami, who happens to be a computer scientist, but he was between jobs and he'd moved to a new city, Pittsburgh, and he decided he was going to be an Uber Eats rider. He loved riding his bike, and he realized how much of a black box these were, and how the algorithms that control all gig apps, whether that's a Swiggy or an Ola, Uber or Deliveroo, or whichever app you may use to order your food in 10 minutes or whatever it is, the jobs are sort of assigned using AI systems. The wages are determined using AI systems. There's no equation, so nobody knows what they're going to be paid per task at the end of a day or a week or a month. It's all dynamically priced, right? And it depends on everything from the weather to whether there's a cricket match happening today to, demand and supply on the day. And so as a worker, you really have no idea what you could be making in a day. And you have no way to improve your lot either. You can't really think about, how do I do better? How do I make more? Because the algorithms are designed to essentially pay you the lowest that they can, right? It's an economically motivated system. And so he basically was very disappointed to find constantly that there was no human for him to complain to, because he's a very vocal person. He calls himself a micro social justice warrior. And, right at the beginning, for example, he found that they kept getting orders for a McDonald's, which doesn't exist anymore. And when he tried to call Uber to tell them to take it off, he just couldn't get a human on the other end of the phone. And what everybody else had realized was it was easier to just keep rejecting or accept it and then cancel, rather than actually trying to fix the problem. But what the thing that really kind of shocked him was, he was paid, and he was told how the distance he had traveled in order to do a particular job, but he felt sure he had traveled much further, and using his coding skills, he managed to decode from the receipt the real distance he had traveled, which they are not told for privacy. So because of our privacy, they are not told exactly where their destination is after the fact, or at the time they weren't. And so he managed to reverse engineer that, and found that he had actually traveled double or something, much more than what he'd been told. And so he built this little tool that he put up onto Google Chrome that anybody could use, and thousands of Uber drivers and riders around the world used it to find that, I think it was, they were being paid on average 30% shorter distances than they had traveled in actuality. And he kind of used this as a way to, again, to part the curtain and to bring some transparency to the process. So for me, that was, as you said, a real learning of how little control they have, especially in an industry where they're labeled as self-employed, and supposed to have full control over what they're doing. But in many cases, it's not how it works.
So the frustration that some of these people seem to face, and I mean, I can in some ways relate to it as well, is that the system has said, like we've got an income tax notice, and we go and meet the commissioner, and we say that this is doesn't seem to be fair, and the commissioner says that, listen, we can't do anything. The system has pulled your name out. So that's the end of the discussion as far as merit goes. Now you have to figure out how to fight it. So no, this is a real example. So and I'm sure the equivalent of that is what you're talking about, where you call someone and they say, we don't know. The system has pulled out your name, or the system has paid you this much, and we have no control over it. So the person you're talking to seems as helpless.
Yeah, they're
as
a
you are.
customer service representative who doesn't have the power to make a change. The other example of the driver in that is a Romanian immigrant in London who was flagged for fraud, and you only get 3 flags and you're out. So he'd already got 2, and he had no idea what he had done wrong, and he had no way to fix it. And so he just froze his account because he couldn't afford to wait for the third strike and then never be allowed to use it again. So instead, he just froze his account and ended up getting a second job. And in the meantime, he's now suing actually Ola and Uber in court in Amsterdam, where their European headquarters are, to understand better the data that they've collected about him and why those flags were done in the first place. Because his view is that, as workers that are part of the system, they should at least be told what they've done wrong so that they can fix it. And there's very little data that they get to see compared to the amount of data that the companies on the other end are using to build these systems.
So I'm going to come to questions in a minute or two. So as you've written this book and you continue to write on the broader theme of AI, what's your sense on where this fight is? In this in the matrix of, let's say, governments forming regulation, companies being pushed back to some extent, either by these let's say unionizing, for the lack of any other word, Uber drivers, customers or consumers like you and me, and maybe other corporations. So where do we stand today?
I would definitely say that the power lies with the tech companies building the systems and rolling them out. There's an excitement, and I think to some level justified, from tech companies, but also all sorts of industries, right, ranging from financial services to law to management consulting, white collar work, creatives. I just met today. I was in Kitab Khana signing some books, and a guy came over and said, I work at a media agency where we make creative videos. And we've been using Sora, which is OpenAI's new video generating technology, and it's made my job so much better. We can show clients examples of ideas that we have. So people are genuinely excited by the potential and the possibilities. And behind them is, a lot of money being that's riding on this, being injected into it from some of the most valuable companies in the world, who see this as the future of their business. So, yes, regulation is going to come. As you mentioned at the start, you have the EU AI Act. India is looking at things like deepfakes, for example, and how to limit those. The White House has its executive order. China has already got some sort of guardrails around, outputs of these AI systems. So that will happen. But I think there need to be more voices, and it can't just be consumers or unions. I don't think that the unions are going to be able to fight back against necessarily a Meta or whatever. But the every industry and people like who work in places which are rolling out AI have to be very thoughtful, because all of the failures, or most of them that I've seen, are not necessarily because the technology went wrong or because it was inherently biased. In some cases, yes, but it was human failures, of no accountability. So we've put in an AI system into recruitment, but who's checking what's coming out the other end? Or if there's an error, who's in charge? Who's holding the pen at the end of the day? And for that, you need other voices too, to kind of think about how we roll it out in a much more controlled and thoughtful way.
I mean, you've spent actually quite a bit talking about deepfakes or and various versions of it, and how people have been victimized by apps. And I mean, that's really my question. I mean, more than the deepfakes, because each example is more gruesome than the other. But the question is, where can you fix this problem? And someone asked me this question, and I didn't have a clear answer. So, can you, for example, go after Google and say you should not? I mean, you cannot host this app on the Play Store or Apple for iOS. Can you, as a country, stop that app being hosted, which, like, for example, India has in the case of TikTok and hundreds of Chinese apps? Or is there some other way of controlling? Because I'm guessing the app makers say that we are creating it for fun. I mean, you put an image and some other nude emerges from it, and that's for fun. Whereas the application of it is destroying people's lives.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you have to start somewhere, right? Like we did this with social media globally, where we said, oh, we're just not going to do anything about it. There's going to be self-regulation, and it's all going to turn out okay. That didn't quite happen, and now we're trying to catch up, and we now have a UK Online Harms Act, and we now have in India, it's come, it's followed like a decade later, and now the genie is out of the bottle a little bit, and it's far harder to put these into place. But we can come out now and say we are going to draw lines, where if it's deep fakes, we have to figure out what's not okay. Is it okay to generate those kinds of images of women without their consent? No. As a society, are we going to draw a line? Yes. Do we think that it's okay for AI systems to decide targets and kill lists and be used in war without any human intervention? No, we are not okay with that. So we're going to put a line in there. So that's up to us. And I think, that there needs to be regulation to say, here are the rules for what you can and can't do, and whether it's the play stores that are hosting it, the app makers themselves, or the websites that host this. I'm not being naive and expecting that we can wipe it out. It's always going to happen. You can download it onto a server, and the internet is borderless, right? But at least we have the rules in place, so that when you are a victim of it, unlike the people in my book, you have somewhere to turn. It's not that you go to the police and they say, well, actually that's legal, so there's nothing we can do about it.
Yeah. Okay. We could talk much more, but questions, anyone, or comments for that matter? Yeah, go ahead. Introduce yourself. That'll be.
Very thought-provoking.
Thank you.
One thing that strikes me is that this apparatus, this innovation is actually judgmental. So based upon past data, it is creating a judgment on an average basis. So what happens whether you're deciding on jobs or whether deciding on tuberculosis, there is a whole segment of people who may not be captured within this. So there's a big dilemma as to, having discovered the right ones out of it, but you have ignored so many others. And that will, so is it too early for this to be released to public for consumption like this without checks and balances? Because so many people who will get covered in the negative of this whole outcome will suffer.
Yeah. That's right. I think because it's a statistical system, it is looking for averages, and it's going to find the most likely outcome based on the previous data. And so things that get missed out are edge cases, right? Whether that's in self-driving cars, when they have accidents, it's because it's that one incident that it's never seen before. And the same for generative AI and chatbots, when they are generating words, making up facts because it's an edge case, something that it hasn't seen, and this comes up again and again. In terms of whether it's too early to do it, I think that horse has bolted. We're already doing it. Microsoft has rolled it out into all of its productivity apps. Copilot, anybody, millions, if not billions, are using it. Google has rolled this out. So through these products, it's already touching most of the world. But yes, I believe that there aren't enough checks and balances. But even from a technical perspective, the people building these, OpenAI, Google DeepMind, Microsoft, they actually don't quite understand why the outcomes of these systems are the way they are. They haven't figured that out. They think that they know that if you scale up the amount of data, the systems become more sophisticated, but they don't know what new characteristics are going to emerge. They just expect it to be more powerful, right? So if we don't know how to evaluate the systems, we don't know what new characteristics will emerge, then how can we put them into consequential areas of our society? So I think until you can be as sure about, say, a healthcare AI system as you are about a drug or a device, you have to think carefully about whether you want to give it the same stamp of approval as you would a vaccine or a drug, right? So I think within each of the industries, we need to be sure that it's at least at the same level as anything else that's approved and in use today, which I don't think it is currently.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Hi, thank you for that wonderful discussion and totally fascinated. My name is Mugdha. And, what I understand is that AI in healthcare, while we are most hopeful about, but if AI screws up there, then what are the scenarios we are looking at? And also personal medical data, how can that be misused? Because AI generated and researched data in healthcare, who all is buying that data? Where is it readily available? Also, like you said, with Digiyatra and all, we don't know the repercussions. We are not made aware of the repercussions, so we have no idea कि convenient तो है, लेकिन आगे क्या होगा हमारे इस data के साथ में. So that, is there a way to find out? I mean, we are also looking at the technology developing before it is critiqued. So is there a way to find out somewhere what are the resources available to us to figure that today our data that is being used everywhere and is being sold everywhere is actually going to do us good? Is there a way out?
Yeah, it's a really hard question because it's the age-old thing of balancing the potential of a new technology and making sure it's doing the good that you hope, versus all of the downsides and harms that we talk about. And I don't think it's the first time that's happened, right? Yes, AI is different to other technologies, but every time you have something disruptive coming in. So an example I often think about, and I think it was in my original proposal for this book, was IVF, which when it was originally invented in a lab in, was it the 70s? It really scared people, all over the world about, we're creating life in a test tube. And what does that mean? And can we manipulate it? And can it have future impacts on humanity in a very profound way? But in the UK, they put together a commission called the Warnock Commission, and it was headed not by a scientist or a doctor, but by a philosopher called Mary Warnock. And she brought together people from all walks of life, experts, ethicists, but also parents, people who wanted to be parents, people who had never, and all of these voices together to come up with a document and a set of principles of if we want this technology to benefit us, what are our guardrails, and how can we make sure it doesn't go wrong? And presented this report back to the parliament, and that forms the basis of all of our laws today. And you can see how IVF has completely transformed the world, right? So there is a way, I think, to bring to bear the benefits of technology. But in terms of healthcare and how it could go wrong, like I think when you weigh up, for me, it still feels the benefits are more. But you can, if you're going to use a healthcare system to decide who gets care, for example, you have to be careful of the outcomes, right? And if they are biased, I have an example in my book of in the US, they had a system deciding who should get additional care for certain chronic conditions using an AI system, and they found that it was systematically biased against African Americans, and it was not because of some racist person who wanted that to be the case, but because of how it was designed, where they had used cost as a proxy for need. And actually, unexpectedly, African Americans cost the healthcare system less than their Caucasian equivalents because they had less access and for all sorts of other social reasons. But by making cost equivalent to need, it turned out that it was often calculating them to have less need than they really did. And so when that happens with an individual in a hospital, that might affect a few people, but that system was being used on 78 million Americans. So you can see how quickly that scales up. So I think that's the difference between a human error and an AI error, and kind of how we should think about
I
it.
think you've talked about the oximeter as well, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we should talk about that's a very interesting. It's a very simple piece of engineering, which we all know now thanks to COVID. But
Yeah, I mean it's designed, to measure your pulse through light through your skin, and because obviously skin with more melanin in it reflects light differently. It actually overestimates, and so if you have darker skin, it tells you that your pulses, your oxygen levels are fine when they aren't. So I would actually tell my dad to discount any readings that he took, and this is in doctors' offices and people's homes, and nobody has fixed it. And it was just an example of how you can
but
have bias by
it's the
design.
underpinning. Of course,
Yeah.
this is an electromechanical device, but what you're saying is, in many ways, is that the whole of artificial intelligence is built like this, or because
Or
it's
can
designed
be.
by, or can be, because it's
Yeah.
designed by someone sitting somewhere else.
Yeah, and it's not always that happens, but I think there are so many levels at which these decisions. It's not just the data; it's who we choose with you talked about Digi Yatra and facial recognition. It's who we choose to collect data about. And I have an example in my book as well in Hyderabad, where it was data being collected from people on motorbikes rather than those in cars, and you find a natural sort of difference in the demographics between the two, and that's also how bias might creep into a system.
Hi, this is Rishiraj. Uh, is there any case study of data from AI being used for forensics and then the results of that being accepted in a litigation or in a court of law? Which means that can you go backward and check what veracity the system of AI used to take a conclusion? Can you open up the black box in that sense?
I guess the simple answer is no. You can't open up the black box today because the deep learning systems, by their nature, they are pulling out patterns that there are ways to interrogate the system, and you can build in steps to see what it's doing, but there's no way to decode it and to kind of back to reverse engineer it, right? And I don't know about forensics, but I know that there was a lawyer in the US who used ChatGPT to look for cases to support a case that he was fighting, and to look for other examples of this, and it came up with all these amazing case descriptions that were exactly in the wheelhouse that he required, with the exact evidence that he needed, which he presented to the court, and they were all made up. And they didn't quite know where they came from, but they did know they weren't real. They didn't know why it had been generated. He had no idea. And when he was brought to court for contempt of court, he broke down because he'd been practicing for 30 years. He was a man of integrity, and he said, I just thought it's an intelligent system that found cases that Google couldn't. I thought it was a search engine. And so I think part of it is understanding that it is predictive, that it can make errors, that it can make up examples too. And that should help us figure out where it can be helpful and where, like a court of law, you can't quite use it yet.
So as humanity uses AI more and more, will humans become more smarter or more dumber?
Um, you know, I see automation bias as a crutch. Often when, and it doesn't have to be just AI, when we become used to the sort of convenience of a machine doing things for us, and it could be very simple things, we tend to stop figuring out how stuff works, and be doing less, doing it less ourselves. So my concern is that as we lose agency or our voices, and these systems become part of what doctors do, what lawyers do, that we will lose some of that craft ourselves. But I'm hopeful that it means that we can use AI to do the kinds of jobs we don't want to do, and we can explore the things that we are really excited about, and it can be more of a partnership. I hope that that's the way it goes.
Hi, I'm Anu.
I'll come to it. Yeah.
I'll make it quick. I thank you so much for a lovely. I'm waiting to read your book now.
Thank you.
But I just would want to share one experience which you said about the Uber driver, that it just you're talking to a robot. It happened with me when we fast had started and COVID, we couldn't go out, and I had sent some parcel which was like thousands of rupees, and in that you have to there's an insurance you do, when you book, and my parcel got lost, and all I could do was reach out to a robot, one machine, and I didn't get my refund. I couldn't find my any parcel. So AI, is it good? I mean, while it makes so much of our chores or activities so easy for us and convenient, but at the same time, when I drive to anywhere, including myself, I look at people looking at their phone and not anywhere else, whether it is a vegetable seller or it could be people sitting in the car. So what is AI bringing in future? Like, people don't look around, or they just look at one device.
Yeah.
What's your take on
Just get
that?
another question.
Okay, we'll do two
or a
at
comment.
once.
Yeah. Go ahead. The lady at the back. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Hi, Madhumita. My name is Ayushi. I'm also a tech journalist, so reading your book was quite an experience. I just wanted to get your perspective on one of the main, let's say, immediate reactions to AI that I look at when I cover the tech sector is there is an anxiety, like quite palpable anxiety amongst, let's say, the initial cohort of engineers and how they can potentially grapple with this technology. Like if you look at what's happening in the Indian IT sector, obviously there is a pause in hiring, which is being motivated by a myriad of factors, but AI potentially also has a role to play there. And even if you, let's say, go and go into these forums where all these techies are coming together, you do see a lot of advice that has been given by top management to the younger cohort to learn how to train on AI. Given the kind of jobs that are there in the tech sector in India at the moment, what sort of initial impact do you see of AI on the quality of these jobs, the number of these jobs, etc.? Yeah.
So there will be short-term pain when it comes to jobs. I think that sometimes we try and paper over it and say, well, ultimately every time there's there's a huge jump or an industrial revolution, we just end up doing different jobs. And I think that'll be how it shakes out in the long term, and I can see how our jobs evolve alongside AI. But I think in the short term, particularly in areas like customer service, call centers, we wrote a story in the FT about the chief of TCS saying he'd said something very dramatic, like we'll have no call centers by the end of the year or something like that.
Just last week.
Yeah, which I'm not sure we're quite there yet. If anybody has interacted with an AI call center system, they are deeply frustrating and flawed. So I don't think we're going to get there in 12 months. But there was a survey at the start of the year where 25% of CEOs surveyed at Davos said that they would have 5% job losses by the end of this year due to AI. AI. So I think that will be there in the short term. But from what I hear from my reporting on engineers in particular, yes, coding is the area. I think that there's been the biggest change when it comes to AI. It's really, really good at coding. And most software engineers I speak to say they are now doing pair coding, where they're doing it alongside AI. But I don't see anybody who feels that they no longer need to do their jobs, right? It's not like some kind of autonomous system that's going to go from A to Z. I think it makes they don't have to keep writing the same blocks of code again. A lot of them say that they're able to focus on the more creative aspects of coding, which they see actually as a very creative profession. And so I don't think that we're not going to need engineers for sure. I think yes, they need to be understanding how to code with many of the today's AI systems, because then yes, they get left behind. And I read something which I think resonated with me, which is you're not going to lose your job to AI, but maybe to a person who uses AI better than you. And so I guess my advice there is just play with it and then figure out its limitations and its potential yourself.
Okay, I think your question is broadly to be answered, but we'll try and bring it into a larger question. But anyone else? Last question, I think. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, Ashutosh. I'm a former tech journalist. I was pretty interested in the story of Sami. The fact that he's just that one person who also happens to be a coder and was able to reverse engineer the whole thing. I mean, what are the chances of someone being in that field, right? And all he could do was just make a very tiny dent in that whole thing. But going away from that, whenever there's been a software that's been made to change things and improve productivity or whatever, there's always been a software to break into that software or anything of that sort. So what how do you see, how real is the threat, with AI in the fray, the underground, where they're building stuff to break into systems, the cyber attacks that you see, how sophisticated are those? Have you come across those? And how equipped are local policing agencies to deal with such things? When you spoke about forensics, I mean, how well equipped are they to even understand the concepts behind these things and to figure out and try and build that trail and nab the people who are behind it, because it's borderless.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll just anyone else, because we'll close after this. Okay, you have a question. Okay, or a comment. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
I'm connected with criminal biometrics. I work with a company which does criminal biometrics, and the algorithms that are designed are used across the world by FBI, Interpol, and now with the Indian police. I've been responsible for. The thing is that there is, though the artificial intelligence helps in shortlisting criminals from the latent prints that are picked up at scenes of crime, to who could be the person as a criminal. But what has been done is that the court of law does not accept that unless and until it is certified by a fingerprint expert to say that what the result that the artificial intelligence system has provided is the one which is. The second thing is that in the DigiYatra, for example, I've been also involved in designing or introducing the systems into the airports. There is a there's a very clear clause that once your data is taken, first of all, you are the owner of the data. The second thing is whatever data is collected at the airport is supposed to be deleted immediately. As soon as the flight, there is a certain time limit that is given, after which this data is deleted so that it doesn't remain, and it only comes back as and when you are going to fly again. So, this is just as a comment to what. So I do believe that the efficiency, for example, of the police force in catching criminals has enhanced dramatically, to an extent where police officers are now not ready to work without the system. You see, at one time in the National Crime Record Bureau, to whom we have also provided the system, the solving of criminal cases was only 2% through fingerprinting. Now it's gone up to almost 24-25%, and it should go up to 40-45% over a period of time. So there are things in, as what Madhu said, it is necessary to have certain what you call checks in place to ensure that you could use the productivity and not just be saying, of course, this misuse can always take
Yeah,
place.
I guess in some ways your comment is an answer to his question
That's right.
about how
That's
you
why
avoid, yeah, how you avoid that. But it is a huge issue. I know that the GCHQ in the UK, which is the I guess the digital spy agency, has been thinking a lot about this in conjunction with partners across the Five Eyes, which includes the US and other nations, about the sort of the security implications of language models and other AI systems. And Microsoft has put out quite a few examples of ways in which it can be manipulated and used. But, you know, as you say, there is always going to be a back end that you can go into and manipulate. So for me, the big disadvantage isn't that it can be hacked, because anything can be hacked. So we have to think about what regulation are we putting into place, what protection of data and so on, to protect when that eventually and inevitably happens.
I think the last question, not last.
The last question of the evening. Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Good evening. I'm Gaurav Agnihotri. I'm not as good with online things, and I'm more with the offline things. And with I'm an avid reader. I've read a lot of books, and I'll be publishing my book this year soon. So, as an author, when you were a few minutes back, you were saying that play with the AI and then understand the limitation. So, as an author, how do you suggest to go through your book? Because how do, as a person, if I'm not comfortable with the technology and AI, how to utilize your book to reach up to that and to understand AI?
Thank you for that. I would say that this book is about humans. The lens is AI. That's the technology that I'm exploring. But in practice, this is about a dozen or so amazing people from across 9 countries who have found themselves unexpectedly interfacing with these systems, like any of us could be in this room, and have found a way to deal with it and trying to understand the social and ethical and some of the personal consequences of that. So actually, this is exactly for people like you. I say that there were 2 audiences I was aiming at. That one, which is people who didn't think they knew about AI or didn't find a way in, who can sort of use this as a guide through human stories to understand it. But it's also for people who think they know everything about AI and tech and how it works because they work in the industry or they've implemented it, to show what happens in the shadow of the systems that they've helped to build. So it's for both of those groups of people to get a more holistic picture, I hope, of how something like this is changing the way that we live.
So I think you've touched upon it. Just to close, I mean, there is the machine. We are enslaved to the machine, and we are also exposed to the tyranny of the machine. So between these two, and it's obviously a point of tension. How are you seeing things, even as you prepare, I guess, for your next book? That's my last
That's always
question.
a big question for
After
an
which
author.
we close.
What's the next book? I mean, I guess for me, the most interesting next stage and the next era of this is, and somebody mentioned this about our relationship directly with AI technologies. With the rise of generative AI in particular, it's become very personal, right? It's gone from being in the background in the apps that we use, on the services that we use, to something that we speak to, something that we use to create with, to write and to talk and to make images and so on. And I've written recently a piece about loneliness amongst young people who are turning to apps like ChatGPT and others and using them as relationship coaches, mentors, therapists, and even in some cases, partners. In China, there's an app called Xiaoice, which has generated 500 million girlfriends for lonely young men who can't find human partners, which I find quite worrying. And so I think for me, it's really fascinating to see how, despite this technology not being sentient or human in any way or conscious even, how we are projecting it projecting it onto it because of its ability to speak in such an articulate way. And I think that's going to change very deeply our relationships with one another, because the companies too are seeing these AI systems as the future of them as being agents. So little assistants that you have, each of us has our own little AI assistant with which we interface with the world, decides where you should eat and who you should talk to, and where you should go on holiday. And we'll entrust more and more of ourselves to these systems which talk back to us and therefore shape what we think. And so for me, that's the next kind of frontier of how it's going to change our lives.
Which is already upon us in many ways. Yeah. Thank you very much, Madhumita. It
Thank
was
you
a
for
pleasure
having me.
talking to you. Radhika, it's back to you.